During pre-patch, there'll be lots of DKs running around, most likely dual-wield Unholy spec. But will that work at level 70 though? And what spec will be the best during pre-patch? That's why I took the PTR and tested exactly that. First off, I'm not some DK master who's been playing it for 10 years, theory crafting and all that. I'm just someone who looked up some specs and guides and wanted to try them out at level 70 on the PTR to see what they can do. So please, don't be mad if I end up doing things a little wrong. For my testing, I'm keeping it pretty simple. I'm hitting only one target, a level 65 test dummy, and Acarus for only 1 minute fights. My goal is to test the bare minimum damage of these specs so we know what the baseline is for them. So I won't be popping off any cooldowns or AoE out of the core of the rotations. So things like Gargoyle, Racials, Trinkets, Pestilence won't be used. So whatever DPS you see will be the minimum and can definitely increase once you implement those other factors in. I still use Death and Decay in the rotation though, as it is really good even for single targets. I believe White Wolf and Rug said that dual-wield Unholy isn't recommended while leveling and that two-hand is better, so in these tests we'll see how they compete. So first, let's look at the gear. The Temple DK on the PTR comes with pre-raid Bisque Blues from quests and heroics, basically gear for warriors. The one-handers is Harvester of Souls and Firebrand Battle Axe, and the two-hander is Endbringer. The first test will be with dual-wield spec. The spec is formatted for level 80, so I had to make some adjustments to make it work for level 70. It's basically the same, just not every talent in the spec filled out. There's no Scourge Strike, only 2 out of 3 points into Wandering Plague, and 2 out of 5 in Black Ice. The glyphs being used are the standard used for Unholy. Just missing one major glyph since we are not level 80. So we are running with Glyph of Death and Decay and the Ghoul. The minor glyphs stay standard across the other specs. Those are Horn of Winter, Raised Dead, and Pestilence. For the runes, the main hand has Fallen Crusader, and offhand has Cinder Glacier. With this dual-wield spec, I tested between using Blood Presence and Unholy Presence to see which seems stronger. For the first test, I did it in Unholy. For the rotation, I start with putting on Bone Shield and popping Ghoul Frenzy. I let my runes finish their cooldown, pop Horn of Winter, then open up with D&D. After that, I pop Blood Tap, then Icy Touch, Plague Strike, Blood Strike, Death Coil, then refresh Ghoul Frenzy as it only has a few seconds left at this point. Then I basically repeat the rotation using Icy, Plague, Blood, trying to keep at least one rune on cooldown so I can drop D&D off cooldown. I pop Death Coils when they are ready and refresh Ghoul Frenzy and Horn of Winter when needed. In this particular fight I did 69,000 damage, 937 DPS. But out of multiple tests, it would fluctuate between 65,000 to 70,000 damage depending how well I manage the rotation and the RNG. For the Blood Presence test, the rotation is the same. I'm just testing to see if the damage is better. It came out very close to the Unholy Presence DPS with 67,000 damage, 987 DPS, which is a little more than Unholy's DPS. With multiple tests, the Blood Presence damage kept staying a little below Unholy's, hovering around 64 to 67,000. Overall, with this testing, it appears the Unholy Presence is just a little better than Blood. When playing it, the Unholy felt a little better for me as well, as you have the faster rune cooldown and the haste buff feels really nice to play with. So next, let's check out the two-hand Unholy spec. I found two specs from Wowhead. One is a sub Blood Frost mix, and the other is a sub Frost. We'll test the sub Frost spec first. This spec is a bit similar to the standard two-hand Unholy spec when it comes to the Unholy tree. Only difference is with Epidemic and Necrosis talents. For this spec, there is no points in Epidemic and Necrosis is 5 out of 5 points. In the Frost tree is the same standard first talents, 3 in Imp Icy Touch, 2 in Runic Power, and 1 out of 5 in Black Ice. The runes for the weapon is Fallen Crusader. Glyphs for this spec change just a little as well. Wowhead recommends using Icy Touch glyph instead of the D&D one. So I tested this out to see which worked better. First, I tried with keeping the D&D glyph. My total damage with it was 64,905 DPS. Then I tested with Icy Touch glyph. It did end up performing a lot better with 67,000, almost 68,000, and 952 DPS. So with this conclusion, I kept Glyph of Icy Touch for the rest of the testing. Just as what I did with testing Dual Wield, I did the same here for Two-Hander, by testing the Blood and Unholy Presence. So first we'll look at the rotation with Unholy Presence. Before the fight, we prep the same with popping on Bone Shield. With no Ghoul Frenzy talent, we can't use it. Then we use Horn of Winter before attacking. The rotation is similar to Dual Wield spec, we just incorporate Scourge Strike in it now. So we open with D&D, Blood Tap, Icy Touch, Plague Strike, Blood Strike, Scourge Strike, then finish with 2 Death Coils. We try to maintain having 1 of each rune on cooldown, so we can use D&D on cooldown. I use Icy Touch and Plague Strike again. We'll wait for D&D to come online and plop it back down. Then Scourge Strike and some more Death Coils, and this is basically the rotation. With Scourge Strike costing 2 different runes, sometimes you need to watch and hold out on it so you can use D&D. From this fight, the damage was 67,000 and 1k DPS. This setup would fluctuate between 65 to 68,000 damage with my other tests with it. So far, pretty much in line with the Dual Wield spec. Next, let's test this spec with Blood Presence. Everything with the rotation stays the same. The damage I got was 73,000 and 1.1 thousand DPS. With the other tests I did, I would bounce between 70,000 to 73,000 damage, with this spec and rotation. So far, this has been the best damage yet out of all the specs. So Blood Presence is a go with Two-Hand Unholy spec. Finally, we test out the other Two-Hand Unholy spec, the Sub Blood Frost spec. So let's look at its talents. In the Blood Tree, we have 3 out of 3 in Subversion. In Frost Tree, we have 2 out of 2 in Runic Power. In Unholy, mostly everything is the same again. Only difference here is we have 2 out of 2 in Epidemic, 1 out of 3 in Morbidity, and we take Ghoul Frenzy. Glyphs stay the same as well. And again, we will test this spec with Unholy and Blood Presence. So let's start with Unholy. Like with Dual Wield spec, we will prep before the fight the same way since we have Ghoul Frenzy. So that means Bone Armor, pop Ghoul Frenzy, recharge runes, then Horn of Winter before first attack. Open with D&D, Blood Tap, Icy Touch, Plague Strike, Blood Strike, Scourge Strike. Finish with Death Coils. Same rotation as the other Two-Hand spec. After a minute, my damage was 66,000 with 1k DPS. I would float between 64 to 66k on these tests, so basically kinda standard DPS with this. Now for Blood Presence. We prepared the same way, opened the same way with same rotation. After the fight, the damage was 65,000 with 927 DPS. And with the other tests, I would range from 63 to 66,000 damage. So let's recap and break down the damage between these 3 specs. Let's start with the strongest one. The Two-Hand Sub Frost spec and Blood Presence gave me the most damage and DPS, being 73,000 damage. Next was Dual Wield spec and Unholy Presence, giving me about 69,000 damage. And last, the Two-Hand Sub Blood Frost spec, with the best damage being 66,000. So White Wolf and Rugs are correct. The Two-Hand Unholy spec will be the strongest for leveling and for pre-patch. So if you are leveling a DK in pre-patch, Unholy will be the way to go. Overall though, everything was very close. So if you don't care about min-maxing, then just play whatever version of the specs look the most fun. You'll still be able to do all the content with ease. I hope you guys enjoyed this experiment. I was really curious how the DK in Unholy would play during pre-patch. And there really isn't a lot of info for the best specs at level 70. I was surprised that Wowhead even had something about DKs during pre-patch. So that is pretty neat. If you guys like this video, please consider dropping a like. That helps me out and lets me know what content you enjoy. And if you enjoyed the video a ton, then please consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow and you can keep seeing the content you like. Well, I'm out of here. Gotta go take the cat out of the oven. Adios, muchachos!